The virus will do its virus thing. Guns will do their gun thing. Narcotics will do their narcotic thing. But sometimes the way we react to these things have consequences and unintended consequences. And I was reading a post on X by Alex Berenson, who's a very thoughtful, interesting guy. And he had similar ideas about COVID as I did at the time. He had a post today or yesterday that harm reduction, is its own ill. And that's kind of, so harm reduction is the concept of somewhat cushioning people from the consequences of their actions, taking away the agency, taking away blame, taking away shame, all that kind of stuff. And it all sounds well and good, but anybody who's had kids realizes you can't do that and get a productive, unspoiled child. You can use a knife to carve a turkey, or you can stab somebody. Cars can be drunken accidents, or you can do mass terror like New Orleans and Munich and whatnot. And so the stories always come down to bigger problems, societal fixes that no bans fix. Like again, heroin's illegal, but people don't stop doing it. OxyContin or fentanyl, whatever, those are illegal. People do them for their own other reasons, and we have to kind of get at those reasons. Simply put, Chicago has a massive black on black murder problem. This is 75% of murdered are black, 71% of murderers are black, and only 33% of the population classified as black. So it's an issue there. Unfortunately, the higher the black percentage in the city, the higher the homicide rate. Hi, I'm Dr. Randy Bock, and I'm honored today to have interviewing me, Dr. Keith Ablow. He's a psychiatrist, a former TV presenter on Fox News, I believe, and he's the head of paintopower.com, and also gained some fame and notoriety, perhaps, as Hunter Biden's psychiatrist at one point, and he discussed that on Tucker Carlson not too long ago. So that's an episode you really want to catch up with. And in general, you should always catch up with Dr. Ablow, who is a free thinker and an amazing guy. But he's here to interview me. So word about yourself and what we're covering today.
Sure. Well, thank you for the little plug for pain, and then the number 2 power.com for people who want to become more authentic, stronger people. That's what I do. I love narrative. And that's why I love you, by the way, because, and that's a good transition, I think, because you're focused on the facts. And I believe that the truth empowers people. And when they try to dodge the truth, they disempower themselves. Right. So in this case, by the way, it's such a great honor to play interviewer to you because of what you've written. You've written an incredibly thoughtful piece, an article about the fact that we shouldn't be content with the myth that gun control is going to fix crime, or that it's going to change the dynamics of racial relations, or rid the country of black on black violence or any other kind of violence. And so I'd love to hear more about why, first of all, why was that topic of interest to you? And you're fairly intrepid, obviously, because you're not going to endear yourself to those who
No,
want
I know
to
it's a
take
funny
our
thing.
guns.
Nobody wants to cover this topic. And it's, I have to tell you, it's a segue from a topic that we sort of hold near and dear to our professional hearts in trying to treat people with addiction. So you and I spoke a few months ago about my methadone article, and everyone's, after watching Dope Sick and Painkiller on Netflix and what other channel, they're all convinced that the opioid epidemic was a result of OxyContin.
Right, that's the standard line.
And so people get convinced, and then now it's fentanyl, that whatever. But they're missing the elephant in the room, which was the introduction of methadone maintenance, and basically a paradigm shift. So thoughts, as our dear leader Barack Obama said, elections have consequences. Well, thoughts have consequences, and it's a funny thing, but the way we conceive of something changes, vastly our reactions to it, and those reactions on us. So, for instance, COVID, this little, I don't know if you ever heard of that thing, but there was a little virus around not too long ago, and the virus does its virus things, flu, bad flu, considering no vaccines at the time, whatever. But the reactions to it, the way we conceived of it, the way we kind of funneled and channeled people, a little bit like the abattoir, we corralled our cattle in a certain way to go towards vaccines, not to a treatment, not to, we didn't do Sweden, we didn't do, so the ideas have consequences. The virus will do its virus thing. Guns will do their gun thing. Narcotics will do their narcotic thing. But sometimes the way we react to these things have consequences and unintended consequences. And I was reading a post on X by Alex Berenson, who's very thoughtful, interesting guy. And he had similar ideas about COVID as I did at the time. He had a post today or yesterday that harm reduction, is its own ill. And that's kind of, so harm reduction is the concept of somewhat cushioning people from the consequences of their actions, taking away the agency, taking away blame, taking away shame, all that kind of stuff. And it all sounds well and good, but anybody who's had kids realizes you can't do that and get a productive, unspoiled child.
Sure.
So these things. So this actually this particular article stemmed from a conversation, endless back and forth and back and forth and back and forth I had with an educated guy. We're both squash players back in the day. He's better than I am, not in many ways, including squash. And but we have diametrically opposite opinions on this. And he is kind of the DEI, affirmative action persuasion that it's all white guilt and white privilege and all this kind of stuff that has brought on the crime problem. And I, back and forth, and I just wanted to, my feeling is not color, it's culture. And that was kind of the genesis of this. And I got tired of, doing this little picayune back and forth debating. I thought, well, he is bringing up interesting points and I really should address them. And while I'm doing it, it's why not put them, pad to paper or, stylus to pixel and just try to get this out.
Well, I think that's great because, as medical people, we know that if you're going to introduce a variable into an equation, you better watch what happens. That's the whole reason for double-blind clinical trials. Right. But it seems like when you add an ingredient culturally, or you add an ingredient you're like, well, let's just unleash this program into the ecosystem.
What
surely
could possibly
nothing
go wrong.
What could really happen? And ideas are that. Ideas are, in fact, no different than a medication taken by someone. And the question is, what's it going to do in the body? So the idea comes up, hey, guns are bad because they lead to violence and murder. That's what's roiling our inner cities. You weren't content to go with that supposition, in part because you're a critical thinker, but in part because your critical thinking is informed by the scientific method. And so when you got into this, and I know you have a presentation related to it, which we can launch into at any time, but sort of what was the headline or a couple headlines that you actually took away from a really deep dive into this? This wasn't, it doesn't seem to me that you started with any preconception. You may have argued with your squash player friend, but when I read this, it seemed to me to be comprehensive, sober, objective, and analytical, the way a doctor would look at gun control.
Right. Well, I have to say, so, Newton said, I'm not putting myself in that category, but I do live in Newton. So I have a little bit of standing to say this. And one of my favorite towns in Italy is Newton. It's actually, they call it Napoli, which means Neapolitano Newton, basically new city.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So I like Napolitan pizza. And anyway, so I've kind of lost track of the question here, but I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. So in terms of writing this, I an admirer and a near classmate in the same residential house at Yale called Colleges, Berkeley College back in the day, with Heather MacDonald, and she writes for City Journal. She's possibly the best reporter out there. She's an attorney originally, but she's been writing. She wrote The War on Cops. and going against this narrative. So I've been a big devotee, and I had her on my show about 2 years ago. And I'm also a big fan, really informed my work, the psychiatrist, Dr. Anthony Daniels, AKA his pseudonym, Theodore Dalrymple.
Sure.
I think he's one of the great writers, fabulous writer, brilliant man. And he's a former socialist. And frankly, Heather MacDonald is a former leftist. And they might also still be current leftists, but obviously the left has changed and mutated. And so they actually both write for City Journal. And their work over time has informed me in many ways. Frankly, as Theodore Dalrymple, his book here, it's called Romancing Opiates. In the UK, it's called Junk Medicine, with the pun on junk as heroin. Informed my narcotic treatment, frankly, before I even started. I read that book before Suboxone came out. And, his conception is that narcotic abuse is a bad thing, but it's not a disease. And this kind of segued into the thoughts behind my methadone article. And frankly, we get into, words have consequences, thoughts have consequences, and this medicalization has consequences. So in a sense, gun control is the methadone maintenance analog of guns. For, narcotics, we're going to, supposedly right now we have, narcotic control, and it's illegal and whatnot, but doesn't really stop the problem. So in a very similar way, gun control doesn't stop the problem, and it, no pun intended, bleeds out into society. And so I'm just going to bang away. You can interrupt anytime you want. We can pull these things down.
Good, great.
But, this is, let's see, here we go. So I'm going to put on my glasses on so I can read better. So this is just the intro paragraph, and we're not going to go over. People can stop and pause and read this if they want. But the concept here is that, in a sense, it's knives aren't problems. You can use a knife to carve a turkey, or you can stab somebody. Cars can be drunken accidents, or you can do, mass terror like New Orleans and Munich and whatnot. And so, the stories always come down to, bigger problems, societal fixes that no bans fix. Like, again, heroin's illegal, but people don't stop doing it. OxyContin or fentanyl, whatever, those are illegal. People do them for their own other reasons. And we have to kind of get at those reasons if we want to deal with the problem. And then, so we think we're dealing with the problem sometimes when we have, Black Lives Matter. The Great Society, the 1960s LBJ program, people may or may not remember or have experienced, was there to fix that. It was part of the civil rights movement. It was there to fix the problem of Black poverty in a sense, or poverty in general. But the solutions brought their own problems. Just kind of having a welfare, money injection for single parenthood. Guess what? Same thing. Basically, grew the problem of single parenthood. So I'm just going to kind of move on. But basically, I mentioned here, the harm reduction strategies. They end up encouraging the very problems they seek to solve. And here we see, kind of going back a little bit, the history of incarceration of Black Americans, and up to the basically 1970s, we were pretty much at a flat line. If you want to go back to the 40s, it actually had decreased. If you look at the peak in 1940 or so, the incarceration had dropped. Now, this is supposedly the deep, dark, part of Jim Crow era and pre-civil rights movements and segregated schools and, parts of the South segregated everything, water fountains and buses and all this kind of stuff. And yet incarceration rates, people would love to have this type of incarceration rate
yeah,
of Black Americans now. But, this graph is from Science magazine. So this is supposedly Science, and it's called Exclusion and Exploitation. The incarceration of Black Americans from slavery to the present. And so from the title, you can get the essence that this author has his Professor Christopher Mueller, he's now at Harvard, has a different point of view from what mine is. So what is his point of view? He argues that he actually never mentions Lyndon Johnson or the Great Society in his efforts to ascertain the rationale for this increase. So I kind of helped him out a little bit here. I put a gap in this thing, the pre and post Great Society. So that's right in the blue thing here. So you can kind of see the before and after. His emphasis, mind you, we're going to have to get our thinking hats on here to ponder this. I'll use my thinking pose here. He emphasized the impact of deindustrialization, declining agricultural labor demand, and economic exclusion, but never, any actions by those arrested in prison. So, he's not really looking at why people are being incarcerated. He's kind of putting the societal, paint job on the thing, kind of, painting over the problem. And obviously we can't, run any laboratory experiments to unwind or rewind the Great Society and whatnot. It's always messy. But you'd figure that, the 20th century with, lynchings, Jim Crow, so forth, didn't ever produce, the incarceration rate that happened after the Great Society. And he never mentions, never touches once on the heart of it, how people live, love, raise their kids. The road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions. And this, pavement basically, invariably runs right through broken homes. And, so this next chart is from the very well-known Black author, Ta-Nehisi Coates. And he got involved with Marvel Comics in kind of the, they wanted to basically, kind of, I guess, ethnically diversify the Marvel universe and so forth. So
Sure.
he's done very well with literally the Black Panther. It's kind of a mild irony because his dad was a Black Panther. They ran a Black Panther bookstore. His dad was kind of like a latter-day Mormon or Muslim. He had like 5 different wives running simultaneously. And Ta-Nehisi Coates grew up, obviously, the sired by this guy, through one of the moms, and they all had kind of this group home. It was very, weird kind of instance. But lo and behold, the hero that he winds up putting up through the Marvel is Black Panther. It does it fairly well from what I gather. I haven't seen the show. Anyway, his article is called "The Black Family in the Age of Mass Incarceration," as if the age of mass incarceration just happened. And he actually quotes Neil Patrick Moynihan quite a bit. And Moynihan was contemporary in the 60s of this great society. And I believe he began as a Democrat as well. But he warned in his famous 1965 report, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, which is contemporaneous with the Great Society. He said that lower class behavior in our cities is shaking them apart. Okay, fine. So we needed to deal with the crime problem. Mind you, the crime problem was just a fraction from that previous, chart.
Sure.
Of what it had been. So if you go back to the 1960s, we would love to have 1960s crime level, but they thought it was wrong. But Moynihan, worried about the collapse of the Black family. And he actually said the principal objective of American government at every level should be to see that children are born into attacked families and that they remain so.
So what happened in 1990 here? I'm looking at the graph and I'm like, 1990, something unfolded that set a new trend in motion, or am I misinterpreting?
Yeah, well, so what you have here is exactly right. So if we look, what happened in 1990 is this is the violent crime rate went up. And then it may very well have continued to go up, except the imprisonment rate was lagging. So this is a lagging indicator. So crime happened, and then we started having greater imprisonment. This is the Reagan era, Reagan Bush era. So they had, kind of took away some of the liberalization of sentencing, and people were basically getting incarcerated more. I'm not sure it had much to do with sentencing, frankly, but crime was going up. So more people got in prison. But as more people got in prison, finally this rate started to go down. So I think it was. I think it's an issue of effect and cause, or cause and effect, one of those things. But obviously they're correlated. But getting to Moynihan's problem, he was arguing that the collapse of the Black family, not just structural oppression, was driving poverty and crime. So, I think we have the Great Society. Black families break up. The boys grow up without a dad, without a role model, without a disciplinarian. And I'm going to give a LeBron James example later. So what we see here is what happened, non-marital birth rates. I mean, the lines are kind of funny because they have different classifications called non-white versus Black, which is the same thing, and then white versus non-Latino white. But you can see that wherever they change the nomenclature, the chart is exactly the same. Through the Great Society was like 1968 or so. Mid 60s, 65, whatever, civil rights movement. After that, the non-marital birth rates wound up going much higher. That is, so Blacks did not have intact families at the initiation of childhood. It's somewhat tapered off, and it's stayed about this level. It's enormously high, 70% versus like in the 1950s, it was 20%. Now, mind you, that's where whites are now, higher than that. So the white families have a non-marital birth rate that's probably 50% higher than what the blacks were in the 50s. And blacks, Thomas Sowell, the economist at Hoover Institute and brilliant philosopher in a sense, he says kind of blacks were doing hunky-dory. Actually, their rate of increase of income was the highest between the 50s and like mid 60s, much higher in general than they are now. There's higher for certain upper levels, but the middle and lower class blacks were doing better proportionally in this kind of Eisenhower era than they had been since after the Great Society. So this is kind of wordy, but basically, Coates, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Moynihan had this thing called Tangle of Pathologies, and he brings up his own Tangle of Perils. Now, I don't want to parse this too much. People should read this, the article, I guess. But this is kind of an agency. Tangle of Pathologies mean there's something wrong with me. Okay, I have to deal with it. I've got my own issues, no doubt. My wife is happy to tell me all the time my issues and whatnot. But Tangle of Perils is external, means that I can't do things because they're outside. So if there's a lot of poison ivy around my house, I don't go out. Or it could be I'm agoraphobic, I don't go out. So maybe it's a little bit both. Maybe I'm too scared of poison ivy, or I'm too timid to cut down the poison ivy, or whatever. That would be something I could do actionable to change the way I want to leave my house. But if I just keep saying, oh my God, there's poison ivy out there, I can't do it. Oh my God, that's the Tangle of Perils. So this is kind of a paradigm shift, if you will, between Ta-Nehisi Coates and Moynihan. So I bring up the Black Panther part. There's a RFK Senior. We have to make that distinction now. It used to just be RFK, but now we have Junior. But his speechwriter from the 60s and whatnot, Adam Linsky, so a liberal, a Democrat. By 1995, he was kind of expelled, from polite society in the Democrat Party because he said something that Jesse Jackson said also, 1993 or so. He said, we shrink in fear of teenage thugs on every street. More important, we shrink even from contemplating the forceful collective action we know is required. I thought of making this is the kind of the epitaph of this article, because this is really the essence. It's something that people think, I think it's what's named Juan Williams, kind of got booted out of NPR for saying the same thing, that he's fearful when he sees a black man on the street. Jesse Jackson said that, when he looks back and he sees somebody's white behind him on a dark street late at night, he has a sigh of relief. This is something that happens, but people no longer can speak of it. So Coates kind of, again, with his Tangle of Perils, he said that, basically blacks tend to live in more criminogenic, which is a new word for me, conditions, but never says why those are there and how getting rid of police, for instance, or not incarcerating criminals and gang members would help that criminogenic condition. And his basic feeling, and he's a Marxist, I believe, he claims that black communities are victims of so-called resource extraction, his term. But he never says what resource is being extracted from those black communities. I mean, is there oil on parts of Detroit and not under other gold? I mean, what's being extracted from that community? It's just kind of an odd formulation.
Right.
I think it dehumanizes. And his solution, mind you, is reparations. And that's, kind of echoes the same welfare-driven approach that fractured families under the Great Society. It's, I believe, a false, kind of Marxian materialistic view rather than kind of the spiritual fix that is needed. Oddly enough, despite all this claims of more racism, amongst whites towards blacks, and until very recently from blacks towards whites, there was kind of a diminution in racial perception. This is evidenced by, kind of steady rise in intermarriage. And this is, kind of where the rubber meets the road. You come home, and your daughter says, I want to marry, it's kind of like the Man Who Came to Dinner, Sidney Poitier, the famous movie.
Yeah. And that wouldn't work today, it
wouldn't be a big deal. people are happy
like, what?
if you're not marrying a robot, or you're not marrying your right hand, or you're not marrying a goat. I'm joking.
Not marrying someone transgender who's a robot. Exactly.
Yeah. So there's actually a comedian who says, we look upon our relatives as so antiquated, whatnot, because we say come home, it's like, oh, here's my lesbian, whatever. relationship. But it's like, how are we going to be like 50 years from now when our kids come, or 20 years from now when our kids come and say, "Oh, I want to marry a robot"? Are we going to be any better? Anyway,
right. Good question. I hope that it won't come to that, but it seems like it will.
Who knows?
So the Great Society, you're saying, seems to have been coincident with and may have fueled this epidemic of violence. And the connection you make is that it encouraged families to break apart because society would take care of them anyhow, and maybe you don't have to be as disciplined because society's there to pick you up if you fall. And that made people listless and angry that they weren't being effective people. Is that some of it?
Yeah, I think it's there. I mean, I can't put my finger on it because it's not as sciencey as gravity and whatnot. But I think there are forces there that play out. I'm going to kind of move along to make best use of your time and my time. But I just think that in a sense, despite the intermarriage thing, the racism industry, going back to the marriage slide here, people are more accepting of different colors than ever before, and frankly, more than any other society on earth contemporaneously or ever, most likely. That's an arguable point, but despite that, the racism industry needs to be fed. We on this chart here, you can see, around 2008. When Obama was elected, a lot of whites, I guess, thought that was the breakthrough. We are in a post-racial society. We have frankly, supposedly our first black president, but he was equally white. Frankly, he's the merger of white and black. His parents, and really, he grew up in a white family with his white grandparents, and they had whatever. He's polyethnic. He was in Indonesia and Kenya, whatever. But nonetheless, it's kind of this is just frequency of use in the Times, Post, and whatnot, of the racism words, and they've really skyrocketed. I mean, look at this. This is like lunacy.
Amazing. Insanity.
So despite the so-called breakthrough perceived by the majority white electorate in 2008 and having elected, Barack Obama, the academy, the universities and whatnot, and our great thinkers like Ta-Nehisi Coates, white privilege. This is from a Google Ngram. This is the use of these words: white privilege, critical race theory, started, and obviously these things have gone up ever since. So we did not get fixed. And the oddity is that actually, again, prejudice is on the decline. These are just from Professor Dan Hopkins. I forget where he is. He's not Johns Hopkins, but Dan Hopkins. He has an article in 538 where he actually kind of couches it. He says white Americans say they're less prejudiced, but his own research done in academic, not 538, shows that these numbers are going down amongst Republicans and Democrats. Everyone has kind of less anti-black prejudice, and it's just an anti-Hispanic prejudice is on the right. So both these things are going down. And again, this is wordy, so I don't expect people to, they can stop and look at it if they want. But basically, you can't even look, even in our, modern world today of having the Library of Congress at your fingertips, in a smartphone or whatnot. If you try to find out whether, there is blacks anti-white sentiment increasing, which I think has happened through the, BLM and whatnot, riots and whatnot, George Floyd and so forth. You can't, almost every Google search, OpenAI, ChatGPT, Bing, Grok, whatever, they all will divert you to something bad that happened to the black community. You can't find anywhere, I wanted to include it. I can't find the similar graph to this one from anti-white prejudice amongst blacks. This does not exist. So if somebody has it, please inform me. But the funny thing is, so this is kind of this relentless framing of white guilt, what I call the racism industry, and it becomes its own, kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Obviously, we have the how to be an anti-racist, which really took over the academy. Ibram Kendi, it's part of the whole kind of George Floyd, BLM narrative, and whether it's Coates, Kendi, Al Sharpton, whatever, there's just kind of this sensibility that things happen to the blacks, they can't break out. So I kind of wanted to look at the counter to that. I mean, frankly, Nigerians and people from Ghana and West Africa in general are former black, I mean, visually blacker than legacy black Americans here, which because of miscegenation and whatnot, on the slavery, whatever, and intermarriage and whatnot. I think blacks here are like 50 to 60% African, and Africans are like 100% African. So people are blacker, and yet Nigerians who've been here pretty much just like 1.5 generations or so, coming like I think in the 90s, they do better. They're right in the middle of this chart here. They do better than the average of Americans in total, right above all USA, and Ghanaian from Ghana Americans do even better than they do. And they're pretty much on par with white Americans who have been here for, say, centuries, many of them, aside from obviously more recent immigration, maybe a century. And Indian Americans, we're kind of median darkness of skin between blacks, between Africans and Caucasians. They do better than everybody else. And they've been here probably, an extra generation from the Nigerians, probably starting in the 80s and whatnot. And so, what happens? Well, obviously, this cohort is a little more educated than legacy blacks. We're on the bottom here. The black Americans are there, but Nigerians already within one generation are doing like probably about 40% higher income than legacy black Americans. We'll call it inner city, whatever. And part of it is selection bias, because they come here having arrived with better education credentials. Fine, but it's odd that immigrants can figure this out and get over here and do this when we've kind of been trying to do affirmative action and all kinds of boosts to black school districts and whatnot, busing, all these programs which are there specifically to kind of raise black Americans. And what happened? Why did it not happen?
Well, and I'll just put in my 2 cents. The motivation for said programs is thought to be innocuous or better than innocuous. We want to help people. There are people who would say, well, that's not the motivation at all. The motivation was to cause racial division, to harm the United States, bring it to its knees, and then put it into a big melting pot with the rest of the world and have one world government, so that these DEI initiatives and the rest of it was meant to tilt America toward socialism, and essentially dissolve it into a non-entity, or into the great world government. And so I don't know exactly what they were looking for. I could see that it didn't work for those of us who care about people, but it did work.
That always makes the assumption that people want the same results as you do. Like when Mr. Obama took the office in 2009, we were at that Bush era crash from the was the savings and loan, was not savings and loan. It was what was the name of that? The housing bubble burst.
Right. The mortgage crisis or whatever.
Yeah. So we were at a recession depression point, and Obama went to the FDR playbook of doing massive government works programs and flooding the zone with money and borrowing and whatnot. And I think that was all been discredited economically, but there's the assumption that he wanted the same thing as what I did, which is a return to a bustling economy. He wanted something different, which we've seen play out. He wanted equity, which had not been really a term of art then. He wanted kind of equal outcomes and spread money around to places and people based on race. So, that's why we did not get the post-racial world that he, maybe espoused or promised us and whatnot. So just kind of moving right along here, I pass over this quickly, but Nigerian thing, this is second generation Nigerian Americans. Their percentage of college graduates, not just attending, but graduating, 74%.
Amazing.
Legacy white Americans are less than half of that. And the legacy African Americans or blacks or whatever are about half of that even. So it's almost, it's almost like 2 to 1 to 2 to 1. So it's almost a quarter here. I mean, you can do the math later of black Americans legacy college graduates versus Nigerians Americans who are just there one generation. Like, what's up with that?
Really interesting. It's culture, as you're making the point. That's your point.
Yes. Yeah, so as far as like earning the money, going back to that slide where the black Americans are on the bottom, there's a little bit of choice here. the legacy Black Americans, I'm sorry to come up with such a cumbersome term, but until somebody comes up with a better one, because we've got Nigerians, where it's not really about color. So again, Nigerians are blacker, if you want to, just look through a simple photography lens, are blacker than American Blacks, and yet they've done better. So, legacy Black Americans, meanwhile, kind of find themselves funneled into a different lane. What I call secure but low growth government jobs, a small business, a little room to soar. This is a study, I think, from Pew Research Center, and the type of jobs from amongst that are, I guess, business related, not government work, but so they kind of like, it's more like postal workers, food service, social work, clerks, home health care. They're steady gigs, but they're rarely the kind that spark innovation or wealth. And so there's been either a choice or kind of a movement towards stability over risk. What's kind of a ceiling that's mistaken for a floor. You're not necessarily going above that. And so, economic independence through education trumps grievance. And Nigerians prove it. They've turned school into success. I had some schooling and whatnot. I mean, obviously there's some Nigerians who are worse off in Nigeria. They're the ones who didn't come here. But, what Coates sees as resource extraction in criminogenic conditions ignores how violence feeds itself. And these other guys, Mueller, talks about, labor, this and that. And Kendi, has anti-capitalism. And Obama himself, he was kind of in the middle of this. And on one hand, siding with BLM. On the other hand, talking about, need for more Black fathers at home. So I'm going to segue here to kind of like a worldview of the problem. If you don't want to interrupt me or let me carry on, what's up?
Carry on, please. I mean, I think
all right. So this is going to be a little bit jarring because I'm going to leave behind BLM and Kendi and Coates and Sharpton and all that kind of stuff, and I want to look at guns. And so we're going to turn more functional here. So yes, the United States homicide rate is 7 times greater than other, what we call top tier nations.
Got it.
With guns accounting for, about 80% of U.S. homicides. However, what they do is they ignore critical difference. Unlike the United States, European nations have had, until very, very recently, much more homogenous and socially stable nations. And, if you include Japan, that's, everyone says diversity is our strength, but Japan is almost completely non-diverse. Like everybody in Japan has Japanese great grandparents, and that's been the case in most of these other countries until very recently. We're going to get into that because they're having in Europe, they're having their own schisms and issues. Previously sedate. Sweden has like the highest rape rate in all of Europe. I mean, it's just not what we're used to. But so I'm just going to put this out there that there's some, kind of subdivisions. This map looks at your gun holdings, and they vary. Then none of them are as high as percentages of the U.S., but there are countries that have relatively high gun holdings. But some of the countries with lower amounts of gun ownership don't necessarily do that well. You can't really see the country subdivisions because the colors are blurring.
Sure.
But, some places like Ukraine and Syria, had before their wars, very low private gun ownership, and in a sense leaves the civilians vulnerable, not necessarily, at risk during peacetime, but unprepared when a crisis strikes, and you never know when a crisis strikes. So in my view, it's kind of like, guns in a sense are keeping an emergency kit, just
sure.
And to have gun control is in a sense refusing people the ability to have that. But the gun picture is not the entire picture on both sides. On one end, like the UK has loads and loads of knife stabbings. Their knife stabbings and deaths from knivings far outpace our knife wounds and whatnot. And the other side is not just about the violence itself, but whether guns have a secondary use. And the Warsaw Ghetto, I'm sure they would have loved to have a few guns on hand even prior to being ghettoized. And so Europe is in flux basically. And so what we see here is Sweden, previously peaceful Sweden, is now kind of up there with, a lot of East Europe places like, we don't have them here, but Albania is the highest, but, there are other parts of former Yugoslavia, Bosnia and whatnot, and Moldova next door. So these, they have other issues, not just gun problems. They obviously have social censorship we're seeing, and they have these Islamic rape gang problems that we've seen in Rotherham, and the European crime is rising. So despite all their gun control, Sweden and the Netherlands were once paragons of safety. They're having huge surges in gang violence and terrorism, and Germany, everyone's kind of crashing. And there may not be a gun death if they kill 26 people in Munich, whatever, with a car, but they're having their issues. And so these societal issues, I mean, if you just keep staring at the gun, you're ignoring the problem. And so, a lot of these things have to do with the people who are there. That Sweden didn't become the rape capital because of the, people who had great-great-grandparents who were Swedes. They have, rape problems because they're people whose great-great-grandparents were in Syria or in, someplace else, whatever. And those are the people doing. So I think you have to kind of look granularly. In the U.S., we always hear, certain states with lax gun control have high rates of violence, and they always point to the South. And we're going to get to that chart in a second. But our hot spots here by coloration, and no pun intended, are the ones in the West and in Florida are Latino based.
Yeah.
And the ones in the Southeast, basically, the southern, the Cotton Belt, if you will, are Black. And so these things track. And not only that, but the tracking has actually gotten worse. And it's kind of, you have to blur your eyes a little bit, squint a little bit to see this. But the red has gotten redder across the nation over the decades. So this is a problem that's a problem, and it's a problem that's gotten worse in terms of violence. But the violence is concentrated in certain areas. And so if you see the chart on the right, we have to modernize that a little bit to the current date. But I bet that's even redder and hotter. But again, going back to the previous chart, that's in the Southeast kind of Cotton Belt. Black areas, which run as maybe as high as like 35% Black and whatnot. So this is an old cartoon, but it's called this is a street light effect. If you look, this guy's looking for his quarter. Why is he looking here? Because it's light over here. So you can look for something because it's convenient to look for something there, but you will never find it if you're looking in the wrong place. So you drop this thing down the alley or whatever. But he can't look there. So people, are ignoring the problem when they're looking at the gun control issue. And the coincidence here, if you look at the Southeast, the Cotton Belt, they have, high rates of gun ownership. Like, oh my God, but look, and they have high murder. Well, but not really. Again, if you look at the map on the left and the right, you see here that, these hotspots is in a very strict gun control area. If you look up in the Rust Belt, very strict gun control. What's up with that? All Eastern Seaboard, very strict gun control. And so, you have to, kind of blow this map up later. But, the gun control has very little to do. This is legal gun ownership, the amount of guns owned legally. So these things, there's a lot of places where there's very few legal guns and people are killing each other. And again, that has to do with demographics more than anything else. And not just demographics, but the social conditions and what people, frankly, it has to do with hope. Barack Obama was right about one thing, hope and change. And he's right about the hope part. When people have hope, they do better, but it can't be just blank hope and endless hope. It has to be hope with accomplishment. And so, we're never shy about saying, for instance, that, men are more likely to use guns and young men are more likely to use guns than old men. So we're kind of, we're men. I'm just guessing in your part, but I can state I'm a man, and we're part of the demographic that's more likely to be violent. Okay, fine, nobody argues that. But as we're older, we're less violent, young people. But you can never talk about that there are other instances that there is, frankly, a Black and Hispanic effect, and so we see here is Harvard's the guy who inspired Bill Cosby during his great run before he was absurdly raping and whatnot. This guy, Alvin Poussin, he's the Harvard emeritus professor of psychiatry at Harvard. He wanted Bill Cosby to present positive images of Black parenting. And he said back in 1983, this is 40 something years ago, he said Black homicide rates are 7 to 8 times higher than whites. This is then. This is the same now. Today, back then, homicide is the leading cause of death among young Black men and contributes significantly to shortened lifespan of the Black male. In about 89% of the cases, the Black victim was killed by another Black. So he wrote this in 1983. So
got it.
what 1983 on this chart is on the left. And here we are. It goes up to 2017. It's even worse than ever. So Baltimore, 40 years, not much has changed. The murder rate, in predominantly black urban areas are sky high. Chicago, Baltimore, St. Louis, they're basically drowning in blood, and the victims and perpetrators are overwhelmingly black. And this is not from me. This is, I think, from the Chicago Tribune. Simply put, Chicago has a massive black on black murder problem. This is, 75% of murdered are black. 71% of murderers are black, and only 33% of the population classified as black. So it's an issue there. This one's going to be hard for people to see, but basically this is a regression analysis, not a political regression, but it's maybe a progression analysis as well, that does homicide rate versus black population percentage. And so you can't really read a lot of these cities' names. Maybe you can see others, but it's a correlation. Unfortunately, the higher the black percentage in the city, the higher the homicide rate. And this kind of comes back to the central problem of the disintegration of the family. And these is over time, going from 1960 to 2010. And Don Lemon, of CNN and whatnot, he says himself, he said, he was actually talking about Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman. He said more than 72% of children in the African-American community are born out of wedlock. That means absent fathers. And the studies show that a lack of male role models, express train right to prison, and the cycle continues. So we'll take the brilliant words of Don Lemon there. I don't think he's wrong. What's driving this violence? People can stop and look at this if they want. But basically, it's gangster culture. It's kind of legacy media. We certainly popularized that. We looked at the last Super Bowl. We had Kendrick Lamar. He's doing gang signs. He's kind of got some war against Drake, whatnot. We can't even say the lyrics of the last, 30, 40 years of hip hop music unless you're black. You can't probably read the entire lyrics of most of these songs, either because they're violent or because they're using that word that must not be said by anybody except the rapper and, certain parts of the population. But, there's a clear gender divide in crime, as we mentioned. And with the breakup of the family, the girls, black girls in inner city and whatnot, have done reasonably well, because even in a broken family, they have their moms as a role model. But the guys don't, and so I kind of bring up LeBron James quite a bit, because I'm very, very, very impressed with his career. And I know we're going to run out of time in a second here. But his mom had a crack problem, but she was wise enough to put him in a family, basically have him adopted by a guy who was a football coach. And that made a big difference. So I'm going to breeze through some of this stuff here. And maybe get to some of the charts. This is kind of the fall of Bill Cosby, sadly enough, and really get back to this kind of cross-cultural country experience here. And just as far as Latin America, which has a lot of kind of analogs to, Southwest United States crime based on Latino culture, there's a lot of homicides. And frankly, our numbers are dwarfed by there. Their numbers are much higher through Spanish-speaking and I guess Portuguese-speaking Brazil and whatnot. And there's this very slight relationship with gun strictness. There's a slight decrease, but basically everything's so much higher than what we have. So this is United States gun law strictness versus homicide rate. Very little relationship. It's mildly negative trend, but very little. Yeah. So if you compare those countries, Latin American countries, with our kind of worst cities, they're on par. So our nation is much less because we're not comprised, just of Baltimore and St. Louis and whatnot. But Baltimore and St. Louis levels are what you see in Mexico, Honduras, and Venezuela, and so forth. So these are side-by-side charts, which kind of, it's like, which of these is not like the other, which shows the stronger relationship. On the left, you see the increase, the kind of the unfortunate positive rate of increase of more homicide, higher percentage of black population, versus on the right, versus just kind of gun law strictness. So I think one has much more to do with the problem. Here we can kind of see where the United States falls as states versus Latin America states. So we have varying level of gun strictness amongst our various states. So California over here on the right is a little bit lower, but so is Texas. compared to these Latin American countries. So I don't think there's that much really to do with gun control law statutes. And just kind of to round out the hour, as it were, Detroit is in a place of high gun control and strictness and whatnot. But their crime problem, they have this kind of big kind of cultural and color inversion beginning in the 60s after the riots there, which were race riots and whatnot, and the white flight, black increase. But the population as a whole has declined. So in the 50s, Detroit was literally the wealthiest city in the United States.
Wow.
In the 1960s, it was the top 5 in the world. And it's not that now. We'll just leave it there. The population has vastly dropped at a time when the United States population is more than doubled. So this time, you'd expect if things were growing just with the rate of the U.S., it would be, like 3 million people. But no, it's a fifth of that. And so, our fourth. And it's like, things did not do well in Detroit. Just kind of keeping in perspective, the United States has its problems, but they're not the worst. This is kind of hard chart to read. Honduras, Jamaica, South Africa, Brazil, Tanzania, Namibia. There are, a lot of countries you may not want to visit right off the bat are over here. Countries you do want to visit are over here. The United States is a place you want to visit. You just have to avoid certain of those hotspots, as it were, and or be armed. I'm going to put a different analogy here. This is from my methadone article. It was often ignored. You didn't hear anything about the opioid epidemic during the Trump first term, Trump 45.
Right.
Deaths dropped in the United States during that time. And the reason for that is because there was better economy. And so I think the answer ultimately to this is that if you want to get fewer opioid deaths, you improve the economy. You give people actual hope. You want to get rid of gun deaths and whatnot, you have to do what the Nigerians have done. You have to give yourself better opportunity, better hope. And that's pretty much where we have. And a lot of these harm reduction aspects of kind of treating extra aspects of this don't really work, and they should be scrapped.
And that it might be that some of the interventions, it's not intrinsic. I mean, you've never made that point. You never would make that point, that there's something, you're making the opposite point. It's not about being intrinsically black that leads to violence. It's what has been done to try to remedy the violence that can then resonate in a negative way with particular communities.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And I bring up Latin America to that point because, depends how you grade these things. Most of those countries are white. Or, they have their own racial stuff. Don't get me wrong. There was bigger slave trade to Brazil than there was to the United States. There's all kinds of interracial issues there. But the point is, it's cultural. When people come and they can't integrate to society, there's high crime. The Nigerians they come educated. They're not integrating to crime. They're integrating to college. So it depends on a choice and what kind of things you nurture. With the Black community, I think they could have had that increase that Thomas Sowell mentions through the 1950s into the 60s and whatnot of increasing and becoming just like the Irish and the Italians or whatever. And kind of like, the Irish came over and the Cambodians came over in the 80s. And frankly, they not only don't speak English, but they don't even see our letters. They can't recognize the letters. Most of them came over illiterate in their own language.
Right.
And within a generation, all throughout the North Shore, if you look at the valedictorian list in those high schools, I worked in Revere, all like the valedictorians all through the North Shore, they're all Cambodian Vietnamese. Like, how did that happen? Like in a generation? Well, it's the Tiger Mom concept and the family together. It's church going. It's cohesive families. And, God knows, I didn't have the perfect family. I love my parents, but they argue, they yell, whatever. Nothing was perfect, but they were intact. They were working towards something together, and they had expectations like Schnooky, sit down there and do your work. Okay, that's your job. We're going to do this. We're going to get food on the table. Your job is to get smarter, and to get yourself out of. We lived in 5 of us in a 1-bedroom apartment in the Bronx, and it's like the expectation was never going to be that's where you're going to be later.
Right. Well, it worked. You got very smart to the benefit of all of us. So thanks for letting me interview you.
Well, I appreciate that, Dr. Ablow. Thank you so much, Keith. We're going to get together soon somewhere else.
Can't wait.
Have another show, and I'm going to get to interview you, et cetera, and the beat goes on. So thank you so much. Why don't you just hang around for a second? We'll chat afterwards.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.